very much for coming. We're about to start the symposium for birds and bicycles, taking flight. This is an exhibition currently on at Momentum in the Conservatoire Italian. It's the final week of the show. We hope to spark your interest so you can still come to the gallery and see it. Afterwards, bear with us for a wonderful film by AESNF, Allegoria Sacra, which it's a little bright, so I would encourage you to come to Momentum and see it properly.
Thank you very much, Rachel. I shall just quickly introduce the other of you. We have Tatiana Arzamba here.
Arzamasova.
I've known you for nearly 20 years and I can't still say your last name properly. I'm sorry.
I'm sorry for that.
It's too cold in here, we're all shivering.
Rachel, key member of AESNF.
No, I'm just A.
Well, you're the woman. Rachel Ritzweiler, who's director, founder of Momentum Worldwide in Berlin. Dominik Lehmann, artist and also academic. Susanna, I'm sorry?
In the free time.
Yes. Susanna Petro, curator of the Collegium Hungaricum here, but also in the Ludwig Museum in Budapest. And Thomas Eller, artist, curator, and in China, artistic director at the Tao Shichuan China Arts and Science Centers. Yeah. So, thank you very much all for coming. Thank you all for coming today. It's a special day. It's the 32nd anniversary of the fall of the Berlin Wall, and it's also related to the Birds and Bicycles exhibition, Taking Flight, of which the artists here are involved. So we've put here today a mixture of artists and curators, really to talk about this whole question of freedom, which seems to be in somewhat of a crisis at the moment. Indeed, it probably always has been, because no one quite knows what it means. It's full of paradoxes. I'd just like to cite one which occurred to me today. I should have thought of it earlier, but sitting here in the Zionskirche, one of the paradoxes of freedom is that if you're a Christian, you were born into sin. And only by getting out of sin, you are saved, you become redeemed in Christ. Well, that's not exactly a free situation. You have to do something. Now, the whole question of free will comes into this. Are we really free to do anything we like? And in the democratic movements that developed out of the European Enlightenment and the 18th century, the problem when one talked about freedom was whose freedom? Is it possible to be free yourself if your freedom is dependent on the subjugation of other people? And I think in its way, many exhibitions that have taken place in relation to the fall of the Berlin Wall have picked up on this. I'm thinking of After the Wall, Art and Culture in Post-Communist Europe. Now that took place in Berlin in just at the beginning of the year 2000. It started in October 1999 in Stockholm, And the whole idea of that was to commemorate the 10th anniversary of the fall of the Berlin Wall by looking at the art that emerged in the 23 countries of post-communist Europe, 23 post-communist countries, really to see what had happened. Had anything changed? No, it certainly had, and ASLF were in that exhibition, and also Dominic, you too were there. And it's only by looking and asking can you tell. And I'd really like to open up this kind of first consideration to the panel about really what they feel happened in those first 10 years and what they feel the state is now. I don't really want a long statement from each person about this, but Thomas, if you can kick it off. You were here in Germany, and you were also travelling a lot in that first 10 years as well, outside into the former East. And then I'll hand it over to other members of the panel.
When the Berlin Wall fell, I was sound asleep. Nobody called me. I didn't have a TV at the time. Only the next morning I realized what happened. You know, I was walking out of my studio and seeing all these people, and I thought, what did I hear on radio while I was taking a shower in the morning? And so, totally oblivious. I was stumbling around, and I was at first a little bit shocked, and then I thought, oh my God, now it's going to take 10 more years before we come to the same impasse again, because I felt clearly, from a West Berlin or West German perspective, that the way things were, it was not sustainable. Of course I was wrong. It took more than 30 years to really come to the same point. And I think that the reflex that I had came from my own interrogation of photographic media and things like that, because if you think about it, central perspective, basically that's the theory behind every camera, puts the person front and center in relating to the world, also in relation with nature. And at that time, at the end of the 80s, we had a discussion here in West Germany about the ecological crisis and everything that is now becoming a big issue again already was there at that time. And it was clear to me that all this would be pushed aside because everybody was so thrilled that we would have a free and just world in the next future, and all the problems in the world would be dealt with. And of course, we're all human beings, so there's always conflict, there's always fight, and if we put our ego first, that's what we get. And so we have to have a very different ego get rid of that front and central position. So that was, I was maybe a little bit young and naive, but that was my first impulse. That's maybe a good way to open up the discussion, not with somebody saying, oh, I was there and it was cool, it was a great party. I actually had a very different sensation.
Yes, Susanna.
So I was still a child when
yes, exactly.
and when the changeover happened. So, but actually, I can join what Thomas said, because I wasn't that much of an observer of the 90s, but I'm the product of the 90s. I was socialized in the 90s. I was a teenager, and I can also say it was. So in Hungary, after the changeover, a lot of things changed, collapsed, and were revealed. It was a very hopeful, a very enthusiastic era. And as someone who was socialized in the 90s, I have to say that by the time I got to the point when I entered my adult life, university, and when I started my work, a lot of freedoms and a lot of values that we thought growing up, what we learned from our parents, in this new world, what we thought were obvious and self-explanatory, they turned out to not to be one of those things. So around the 2000s, when I finished university, so what happened is we could finally research and talk about and write about art from before the changeover, from the socialist era, official art and non-official art as well. So basically that was the 90s were the time, and around the 2000 when art historians and experts started to properly deal with art in the 70s and 80s. By the time I came out of university, all this euphoria and all this positivity kind of turned on itself, because we realized that as we thought individualism and globalism wasn't what we were expecting it to be, and that's when all went downhill.
Yes, can I just take it to the other end of that? Tatiana.
Thank you. I don't like to remember, this first day of breaking the wall. But, with the time, when we start to more and more clear understand what happens in reality, in 96 of last century, we did the project. We just had the idea to reconstruct Berlin Wall, but to make it new, nice and improved with a high technology, with a neon barbed wire, with a beautiful, fantastic, aesthetical, details of new times. And those time I was a little bit maybe too oriented to literature, and I started to write a kind of Bible story about, fake Bible story of course, about the wall between two neighbors. But my friends told me, how you dare, to create a fake Bible, let's do the prayer. And we did the prayer with this project. Oh Lord, please divide west from the east, north from the south, poor from the rich, and thick from the health. And this project was shown, several times, but now it's a little bit forgotten.
I'm sure you know ASF's work, but they excel and in fact insist on turning things on their heads. So one of the strategies in their work is to turn upside normality or normal ways of thinking, ways people, and in that way they uncover the cracks in the fabric. I won't say any more at the moment, but just to put those comments in context. Dominic, you were in Warsaw or Poznan?
Am I allowed to take off my mask?
Yes, you are. Yes.
This is a question which is somehow a reference to what happened and where we are now. I don't really know what to say, because what we're talking now about is, I presume, the distance between what was there, which was before you invited me, David, for the exhibition After the Wall, and how I perceive it now from the perspective of sitting in the middle of the church, which is an institution which, in fact, quite strongly corrupted the idea of freedom, and it plays its active role now in Poland. I mean, I do not say like in general maybe, but in Poland definitely it has its very specific role in terms of the idea of corruption of the freedom, or the idea of freedom right now. So how to cover this distance, also speaking of the church, which took active part in the solidarity uprising, and how much it had all changed after the illusion. After when you were asking me about the question of falling wall as a symbol, I wouldn't necessarily find it as an expression of freedom, because, and this is maybe something which I would like to carry on later on with our conversation, that I do not believe there exists such a thing like expression of freedom. And I say it from actually this position of sitting here in the church, which of course is already the restraint of a certain idea of freedom, or at least a projection of freedom. So I say it again, there is no such thing like expression of freedom from my point of view, artistically in specific. Before and after, there is this church in San Servo in Italy, in Venice, which I currently visited because of the project which I'm going to do next year there, which has to do with madness. And there are these photographs of the patients. They have a wonderful archive of patients. And they are photographed before and after the curation, which you can compare also. I mean, we also curate it now by force healing mechanisms in general. What I can say is that you have a photograph of the person who is apparently mad, and he's got his hair a little bit untidy and kind of a mad look. And he's photographed in that sort of really casual way. And then there is one who is already cured and normal, and the only difference is that he's shaved, he's got a tie, and he's got a nice haircut. But the way how he looks is actually the same. So if you ask me about that distance, I would rather see it that way. Nothing really changed, and the worst thing that is to be experienced by the person from my generation, we can cover the both, because I'm 1969. So I can still remember what's been going on before the end of the war and after that. And I think this disillusionment comes from covering the two areas and the recent fear in Poland amongst my generation that actually we playing the strategy of a loop. There is a loop involved with the whole Polish politics at the moment. So just to cut it short, my impression of the West before the war was my first trip to Norway, which I paid a visit to my uncle who's a psychiatrist in Trondheim. And it was a disillusionment, because I lived in this bubble of a projection of Manhattan, London, and it was a Western capsule. And then I arrived in this Trondheim little wooden town, and it was just like, is this West?
Norway,
yeah. So we're speaking about these two disillusionments.
Yeah.
After the war, my only idea of the freedom was, I could basically hitchhike to Paris, and that was the thing. But now we're going back to another part of the loop, I'm afraid, and this is something which I wouldn't like to pronounce, especially with such a company like you are, known for prophetic images.
So, in relation to Afghanistan,
for example. So I just maybe just end up with this feeling of a loop, and just give you the microphone.
Thank you very much. I mean, you've really risen one of the important issues of the institution of power, the state, press, economy, and the church in Western societies. And certainly the conclusions of the 10 years after the fall of the Berlin Wall, and the exhibition after the war, was that the management may have changed, but things themselves hadn't changed much. The poor were still there, power was maybe transferred into different hands, maybe the corruption was more open, and it was very difficult to see changes in that. But then the question is whether freedom can't be exercised in such places. I mean, as you were implying, but whether it should be, whether it's a personal thing. But then there's a question of whether personal freedoms impinge on other people's freedoms, And the question then is whether art itself is one of the few places it is possible to be free. And I'd like to hand this over to you, Rachel, in terms of your experience of these recent exhibitions, Points of Resistance and Birds and Bicycles.
So, to put some context into David's passing of the microphone to me, together with Constanza Kleiner, we curated in April of this year an exhibition called Points of Resistance, which took place right here in the Seelenskirche. We were very lucky because it was the only show open during the lockdown, and thanks to Berlin's policy of open churches, we were able to invite the public in to see art by 75 exceptional artists, including ASNF and many others who are here in this room, and several of whom are also featured in Birds and Bicycles. There's a great crossover between the two exhibitions in that they consider jointly, but in different ways, ideas of resistance and ideas of freedom. And the question then would be, do you need one to have the other? In Birds and Bicycles, which is on show at Momentum, many of the works address, it was specifically the topic of the exhibition, to address ideas of freedom through the metaphor of birds and bicycles, physical and metaphysical freedom. So you have works like Mariana Vasiljeva's Microphone, which springs to mind as I hold this one in my hand, which is actually a bronze sculpture, slightly larger than life size, of a microphone made out of a grenade. We live in a moment where speech is particularly incendiary. It has a huge power through social media to be misinterpreted, misused. Propaganda is nothing new. Fake news is nothing new. But in this day and age, it is particularly rampant. I don't know if that fully answers your question, David, but I'd like to pass it on to the rest of the speakers here. As artists in Birds and Bicycles, Tatiana, Dominic, as curators who've dealt with all of these issues. I'll pass it back.
Okay. So the question is?
Maybe I'll go for a second.
Oh, okay.
Well, all this sounded pretty negative, so I want to say something to the contrary. I think, life for some of my friends that grew up in communist Europe, life vastly improved. I mean, they could travel, they could meet. I mean, there is a large aspect of freedom that was gained through the fall of the war and the subsequent fall of the Soviet Empire. So we should not dismiss that. I mean, this was a great achievement, but what it also did, it kind of took away the antagonism between the two systems, and then, this one system that we all live in now has become rampant. I mean, the reach of capital goes deep into every crevice of our human lives. I'm sometimes joking that maybe in the future, even kissing your wife, you would have to charge money for or something. Everything becomes expressed in value in monetary value, and that is deeply, deeply troubling to me. I think, and that is something that kind of takes away, freedoms that people were enjoying behind the Iron Curtain, when money actually didn't matter much at all. And that's why so many people in Eastern Europe were ill prepared to come to the West because they didn't expect those freedoms to be taken away from them by the force of money. And so that's a huge aspect that everybody has been complaining about. Also my friends in China, they say, had we only known early enough, our life would be so much better now. But everybody comes from a certain perspective and then interprets or misinterprets what happens. But let me come back to the question of freedom on a rather more structural observation. I mean, Rachel, you mentioned that right now it's very difficult to say things. You might tread on somebody's feet. You're not considerate enough of another person in the group that this person wants to belong to. And that is, I experience that as a separation of society, the openness, the innocence that I had when I was growing up, meeting people from different walks of life. You could just talk with them and ask them stupid questions like, where do you come from? I mean, I don't dare ask that question anymore, even if I say that just with full sympathy of that person, because it might be misinterpreted. So, freedom is being taken away in the name of freedom. That's really what we have at the moment. And that is problematic, and that comes from a certain kind of definition of freedom, because most people think they're free if they can free themselves from a real or imagined oppressor, right? It's always free against something else that is trying to take my freedom away from me. Now, when you live in a rather open society like Germany is or was, I'm careful again, what does that mean? I mean, who's oppressing us in a major way? So I can't express my, myself. Now the pandemic has taken a lot of that away, but forget the pandemic for a moment. Just before the pandemic, in Berlin in particular, you could do whatever. You could just even walk down naked in the street and people would just laugh. In other countries you get arrested for this. So coming back to freedom against something, and I think that's a distinction that Nietzsche made once. He said, I'm not really interested in you telling me what you want to be free from. You tell me what you want to be free for. What's your purpose? What do you want to do? And that is maybe something that for artists is very, very attractive. That thought, okay, I can imagine a life for myself and I want to give my life a purpose. And therefore, I'm an artist because that's the best way to express that kind of freedom. Not against something, but for something. And then you actually can't do this alone, because if you're free, well, you end up being alone. No, you have to be with other people. And so free for something, free for community, free for something, that would be such a big achievement if we reformat that term freedom, not in a sense of, get rid of something that oppresses me into something that gives me purpose, that gives me meaning in life, and that includes other people. Doesn't put me center, but puts me in a communication or a dialogue that is actually fruitful. So enough, we're in a church and I feel I'm preaching.
I'll convert.
No, it's very, very well put, Thomas. The different meanings of freedom and the tyranny of identity, and the fact, of course, many identities have been historically suppressed and still are. And they have a right for outrage. But now other people, other than they themselves, are probably still oppressed, but people on their behalf are getting furious. and it's sort of, you get this vicious spiral of reaction, which is really not looking at it's not freedom for anything, it's freedom, actually negative freedom, stopping things from happening, rather than people coming together. Susanna, I mean, you remember a little bit of the time before the wall came down, and I remember it too, but maybe more vividly. It was the star country of the Eastern Bloc. There was private enterprise opening up little cafes and restaurants, and Bela Kadar was there, the old butcher, but he had a smiling face and wanted rapprochement with the West.
That's why Hungary was called the happiest barrack, I think. Happiest corner of, of socialism. So it was, especially in the 80s, it was soft socialism. But that's one of the other things that. So now we are all, again a little bit back into this double. This ambivalence, like West and East, and East is not free, but West is free. But what it's always to me freedom and also free will are always funny words, and we shouldn't deal with them as black and white, because as also Thomas mentioned, there was freedoms in the East, especially even before the Iron Curtain fell, that in the West people didn't know, and vice versa. But also nowadays I feel it's more about, as you mentioned, the management changed, but the structure is the same. And I don't know about every generation, but definitely my generation feels that the structure is the same. And yes, the management might be different everywhere in the world, but we are in a loop, and we are seeing signals around the world that kind of signal that we are back in a loop, and we are making the same mistakes again, let's say. But however, with freedom of art and freedom of artists, I always feel that we're never completely free, especially if we just look at the art industry itself. It's never free from, let's say now, from money, and it's always important to be able to say what someone wants to say as an artist or as a curator. But there are always limitations, and the limitations are not that much about regimes, but it's more about the structure itself of art, which is never ever independent of society and what the biggest picture is around us.
Yeah. Very good. Do you want to?
Yeah. Well, I don't know. I really get straight to the point. What I think is because a few things that came to my mind, and I don't know which one. The first one was some time ago, but the last one regarding your. It's like we in the church, and speaking of the structures, you can say that the art world is also a secular type of church. So the problem with the power becomes when it becomes tautological, and the problem with the power of the people who are now trying to make this loop, as you were saying, is that they kind of play the power in a tautological way, not for the purpose to make the kind of a positive vision for the future, but just to maintain the power.
Tautological.
Tautological.
Totalitarian.
Tautological.
Tautological. Okay. Yeah. Thanks. Sorry.
Power for the sake of power.
Yeah.
I think that's I think quite important that you pronounce it in the structure, because it's another structure, and I would say the art world in fact is a kind of a secular church now, in many ways playing the same role with the same bishops, with the people who take art. How would you describe Tate Modern or MoMA? They're kind of contemporary secular art world cathedrals that they have their own popes, they have their own bishops, and as long as they play the tautological game, it becomes the equal kind of comparison with what you just described in terms of the power reference.
Well, does art have to be in the art market to exist? No. But a lot of artists, at the time of the change in the fall of the wall, I remember, oh dear, I've forgotten his name, he was from Yugoslavia. He said, "He who does not speak English is not artist." And he made it as a doormat with that text on it. And it's been repeated since then. And in a sense that is true as well. The art world is the least free of places, but I'm talking about artists. Are artists free? But anyway, Tatiana,
Yes.
I want to know what's going on.
I want to know about freedom
your idea of
to talk about freedom for. In this sense, I'm rather happy because I am completely free to think, to create, but next steps, it's not related with the freedom, because when you want to think, you can think. You want to create, you can do the sketch, you can do your idea completely free. But then next step, it's not free at all. Mm-hmm. So we should think about how we can create it. What will be the budget? How we can, to show our idea. In what museum, with whom, who will be curator. And it's fields of total not freedom. It's total fields of dependence.
Yeah. I remember back in the 80s, when funding was being cut seriously in the UK under Margaret Thatcher, coming up with the slogan, "Ideas are free, but exhibitions cost money." And you had to find a sponsor for these. And sponsors have demands, and their demands are often manifold. So you're right that if you're ambitious and the work you make depends on significant injections of money to make it work, then you've got to find someone and you haven't got it yourself, who's comfortable with it.
But to talk about that in the church, it's very good.
Yes. Is it just romantic to think that back in the days behind what we call the Iron Curtain, that artists they didn't starve for the most part. They had some kind of basic existence minimum, and provided they didn't cause trouble, they could do more or less what they want. And that many, when they got outside, were quite shocked. I think you said, Dominic, to find that you actually have to survive. That there's no income coming in. That the climate is free, quotes. You're in a democratic climate, but it's not really free because your access to production or to being seen, to exhibition, is limited. Isn't this one of the big paradoxes we're talking about?
Oh God.
Right place.
What I think now, because we talked about the transition, but I'm still quite skeptical about the art market as a driving force in, I don't know about the other former Eastern European countries, but already actually existing in such serious industry-driven way as it exists in Berlin or past the order. I think it's not really the question of the money which exists, it's a question of the audience. It is really a question of the audience, whether we can really compare it. And if I think about Poland, it's still, speaking of survival, there is still a question of whether you're being a lost academic, like I am, which is kind of a complete failure, some may say, or be an artist who's supported by the certain very limited sources of the support, and also influential in terms of there are loads of great Polish artists, but they do not have the support by the galleries because the art market is very limited. And there is this very tight neck of the political relations in Warsaw that can really make the choices that not necessarily the choices of showing the real situation, but the choices that are politically driven. And this is a kind of a disappointment, because suddenly you have the idea that somebody, after the opening up, there's a question of controlling the exposure, which is a problematic, but it's not a problem in Poland because the audience is also limited. So nobody bothers really, as long as it's not politically questionable. And then you go into the situation when, you know, somebody may feel offended, which is this terrible, and this is a question of the freedom again, the law, which makes artists being somehow threatened by this possibility that somebody may feel offended on your exhibition, and you end up in court.
Well, I grew up in a world where there used to be an avant-garde. It sort of died sometime in the 70s, I think. I heard anyway. And its job was to offend people. We've all gone democratic now, except that what we're describing isn't democracy. And we're also describing a rift between artistic production and as you say, an audience. And maybe that has been caused by commercial concerns, by a market, that it being a market, rather than something that people do and is circulated publicly outside, like the bear outside, or in museums or galleries. And there's never a shortage of good artists. I mean, there are many bad ones too, that's for sure. But traveling around the world, my great sort of realization when I did start to travel, the late 70s and 80s, was that there was so much good work out there that was modern and contemporary, we just didn't know about.
Do you think we know it better now?
A little bit.
I doubt so.
Well, a little bit. I mean, we talk about globalization, that's the market, and it's reductive. It reduces everything down to its own level. But it's a matter of what the institutions are doing. Now, one can't blame galleries, and I don't blame the market. It survived because of a very good function, but it won't do everything. And it's the public art institutions and universities that need to be researching what's going on and fueling a dialogue about quality. Because you shouldn't bother very much if it's not any good. That's not just one person's opinion, it's a number of people's opinions. And it's actually the thing itself and whether it catches people. Now, people get caught by memes, they get caught by NFTs, whatever it is, lots of kitsch, but they also are hungry for something better, for something more. And communication, a two-way communication. If art and artists don't want to communicate, they shouldn't be too surprised if people are not bothered about them. It's not that they don't want to communicate, it's not bothered. So this is the dilemma we're finding ourselves. Looking into history, we find lots of good art. Looking outside now, we find lots of good artists who are really trying. And I mean, the exhibitions are doing a momentum, showing known artists and less known artists. I mean, you really prove that fact. But I'd like to bring this statement, what I think is a situation, round to the question about art as an institution itself. It's not institutionalized, but it's an activity which we slot around the world. Is there the possibility of freedom in that, as long as you don't need lots of money to do something? Now the question, obviously, how do you live? My daughter's an artist, I tell her to have another profession to support herself. But it's important. It can't just die, and it won't die. So where do we go on from that? Tatiana, what do you think about that?
I think that it's really difficult to say a common way, first of all.
Sure.
Because art is a territory of private freedom, and of course our private ways should be every time different, and it's difficult to recommend your own experience to someone else, or to tell that you know something, because even you don't know something general, because every time you should move and turn your vision, your mind, and to move every time of a new way of freedom.
Yeah, in a sense, I mean, your work as a collective its sardonic view on the world as it is actually is somehow avant-garde in the old sense of the word. There's still a place for it.
Yeah.
For independent thought, as in any new field. A science as well, independent thought, that's where you get the movement.
Thank you.
Rachel. Oh, sorry.
Okay, there are a couple of topics, I guess. Maybe I'll quickly work through them. Complaining about resources or lack thereof is, in my view, not a discussion of freedom at all. Because I see that more as some sort of communication. If you do something that other people want to participate in, want to see, and then they give you the money for this is kind of successful communication, right? Just structure. Of course, we don't live in a world when money doesn't count. If you want to do anything in the world and forget about art, you need to make it happen somehow. You need to work for it. So that's part of the work. It has nothing to do with freedom. The market, the art market, has nothing to do with freedom or lack thereof. It's communication. Right? The freedom that I'm more concerned about is the one that happens here and maybe here in your head and in your heart. That's where freedom and human interaction takes place independently from markets. That's one thing. Now, when we look at the art market or the art scene itself, in the beginning when I first came to Berlin, it was possible to actually know almost everybody who partook in the art world at that time. Forget about this today, it's impossible. So I think there are more artists alive today than ever lived on this planet before. And, in a way, the art world is weighed down, bogged down by its success. There have never been so many artists. So also therefore there cannot be a discussion about avant-garde anymore, because people do all different kinds of things. They live in, mentally, they live in different centuries and in different cultural environments where they come from. All this needs to be mediated. So it's part of the success of the art world that we cannot have that one discourse anymore. I think it's structurally impossible. So what I've been talking about for the past 15 years is that maybe the art world should differentiate out. Like right now we're constantly comparing apples with pears, and apples and oranges, I think it's in English, and it doesn't make sense, that kind of communication, because you're in different discourse corners. So I'm praying every day. Metaphors just come, that people like-minded, or people that actually would have a certain kind of strong respondence to one another, would form sort of pockets where they can have successful communication. Right now what happens, because everybody is going for the same kind of budgets, people and juries, they have to decide over things that cannot actually be compared, and it doesn't make any sense. So that is maybe growing pains, that in the future this will differentiate out. It's a Luhmann argument. But I think there's a much more different relevance for the art world at the moment, because we all know that in the future there will not be much work left. It's all going to be made by computers or by AIs and robots and things like that. So more and more people are being pushed into being free, into being, they're forced to be free in a sense, and they can't make sense of their own lives. So they're threatened, they're afraid, and that's what you get. That's why you get all these people right now that become, extreme in one way or the other, because they don't have a place in life anymore, and they never learn to give themselves purpose. So the purpose of art could be to teach other people how to give their own lives purpose. So in that sense, Joseph Beuys was very prophetic when he said, jeder Mensch ein Künstler. Everybody will be forced to be an artist because there's nothing else left. And that's why I see art is so relevant, because from the example of artists, people can learn how to live their own lives better.
I just have one quick reflection on this. Friedrich Kiesler came to my mind with his famous quote: "This art is teaching of a of the resistance." And I think what we just say, from my painter's point of view, is that art may help teaching people how to express not freedom but restraint, because that's what I feel art really does. Art is expressing the restraint rather than the freedom, and I think the confusion could exist in a situation when everybody, as you were saying, is trying to express the freedom instead of trying to express the restraint.
That's a very good point.
Yeah. Well, I think this is a very good point. Actually, we have to wrap up, but I think I won't say we have got somewhere actually. That actually art is a gift. It's not a right. And it's a gift that has to be respected, if it's any good. So thank you very much all for participating, and thank you very much all who came. Thank you.
Yes, thank you to all the speakers. Thank you especially to Constanze Kleiner von Wiese, with whom we organized this event and so many other fabulous cooperations. I should thank the German Foreign Ministry for funding Birds and Bicycles, speaking of support. And I would encourage you all to please stay in your seats and watch Allegoria Sacra, which will shortly be playing here on the screen, and come join us for the final week of Birds and Bicycles at Momentum, which is on until Sunday. Thank you very much.
And thank you, Rachel and David, for that panel and these great thoughts. Flower context of our inauguration, Tatjana, and for your great
Thank
work.
you.
This is for guys. The red one is for
Gender specific.
Yes, gender specific. You became
Thank you. Merci. Oh, I haven't had one of these. Ever.
Okay.
Might be a revision song contest.